Chapter 11. Bobo Brazil meets the Sheik. The next time I woke up, it was just starting to get light, and somehow I was in the front seat and Mama was in the back. When my eyes got used to where they were, I saw Dad holding the steering wheel with one hand and resting his other one on the mirror outside the car. The green lights from the dashboard made his face look puffed up and tired, but he was smiling to himself. I knew what woke me up this time. The altar glide was stuck. As we drove, the record was saying, "And don't forget who's tit, and don't forget who's tit, and don't forget who's tit, and don't forget who's tit." I started to say something to Dad, but he looked pretty happy, and before I could open my mouth, the record hypnotized me back to sleep. The next time I woke up, it was bright day, and Joey was in the front seat drooling all over me. The altar glide was still saying, "And don't forget who's tit." Dad must have heard me breathe different, because he looked down at me and said, "Well, well, well, look who's decided to come back to life." "Hi, Dad. Are we there yet?" "Oh, no. Et tu, Brute? You are my last hope, with Bai and Joey and your mother popping up every few minutes asking, 'Are we there yet?' It's been like a stuck record." "Dad, it is a stuck record." Dad seemed to notice the record player for the first time. "Ah, that. Well, Kenny, I'm afraid it's more than a stuck record. Something isn't working right." He lifted the arm off the record and looked in the back seat at Mama, who was asleep. "But let's keep that between you and me, okay?" "Sure. How long before we stop?" "We'll be at Grandma Sam's before you know it." Joey had been listening to us. "Daddy, that's what you said the last time. How much longer? I am sick of this old car." "Not too much longer, honey." "I'll stay up and keep you company, Dad," I said. "Yeah, me too," Joey said. I don't know who conked out first. I didn't remember anything about coming into Alabama. I don't think any of us did, especially Dad. We'd been in the car so long that Dad had started growing a beard. Little tiny hairs were coming out of his face. Most of them were black, but 9 or 10 of them were white. Dad was looking real bad. He was still smiling to himself, but now instead of a real smile, it looked like he was gripping his teeth together to get ready to bite something. The worst thing, though, was that he had turned the radio on and was listening to country and western music. He was even tapping his hand on the steering wheel like he was really enjoying it. "Dad, do you know what you're listening to?" Dad decided to cut up. "Kenneth, I've been thinking about having all our names changed to country names when we get back to Michigan. I'll be Clem, you'll be Homer, Bai will be Billy Bob, Joe will be Daisy May, and your mother will be... Well, I guess your mother's name can just stay Willona. I don't think we're gonna find a more country name than that one, do you?" Me and Dad cracked up. Mama's head popped up from the back seat, and she said in a super southern style, "Okay, Clem, I hopes when us get to Birmingham you can explain to these here babies, Granny, how you come turned them into little zombies from sitting in this car for so long." Dad laughed. "Now, Alona, you know it hasn't been that bad. In fact, I'm going to admit to something that I probably shouldn't." Mama rubbed her eyes and put her hand on top of my head. "You gonna do this here admitting in front of little Homer here?" Everybody started waking up and stretching and scratching. Mama kept teasing Dad. "And what about some victuals, Clem? The sun been up for hours, and you ain't even been out to check them trap lines to see if we gonna have some coon pie for breakfast." Dad yelled out, "Yee-haw!" and then said, "Haven't any of you wondered why you've been sleeping like a little herd of angels?" Byron said, "Like there is anything to keep anybody awake in this car full of squares." "Anyway," Dad said, "I'm gonna let the cat out of the bag. I've been using 2 kinds of mind power to keep this ship going so smooth. First, after a while, I started locking into the road, and there was nothing to it. Just me, the road, and the brown bomber. All turned into one hum, and as long as I listened to that hum, everything was fine. My biggest worry was you, Alona. I knew that after a while you'd figured out that I wasn't going to stop, and you gotta admit you were good and salty about it at first, right? You know I still am. Mama was upset because all of her notebook planning had been wasted. But Alona, you gotta admit that once you figured out how much money we'd save by not stopping, you went along with it. Mama kind of grunted, not saying yes and not saying no. Dad cleared his throat and rubbed his hand over the little stubbles that were coming out of his chin. We all knew this was a sign that he was going to start acting the fool. He had tested Mama to see how mad she really was, and then decided it was safe to play around. Yup, he said, rubbing his chin until it made a scratchy, sawing sound. 18 big hours in a row, nearly 1,000 miles. I had a load to deliver and, he punched the air with his fist, I delivered it. It's just like this great song I heard a couple miles back. Big Daddy was a truck driving man. I'm not gonna lie and say it was easy, There was many a time I wanted to stop, but when those times came, I just think of my old pal Joe Espinoza, driving all the way to Texas without stopping, and I'd keep my foot in that tank. Oh yeah, there were times when your mother was giving me looks like she was gonna kill me the first time I slowed down, but I just kept on smiling at her and kept the brown bomber chugging on. I'd tell her, you're right, sweetheart, we'll just go a little bit farther. And you kids, you talk about some pathetic, tortured-looking little faces. 18 hours in a car can age a kid 40 years. Yeah, I swear I've been looking in the rearview mirror wondering where my babies were and where these 3 bad-dispositioned, sour-faced, middle-aged midgets came from. But your sorry little mugs couldn't stop me either. In spite of all the crying and bawling and moaning and wailing and gnashing of teeth, I kept pulling on. Dad must have been real tired. He hardly ever talked this much straight. I got to admit to the other trick I used too, but I can't take full credit for this one. I hoped Dad was going to say that I helped him by keeping him company, but no, some of the credit has to go to Scientific Popular. That was the name of the magazine that came to Dad in the mail every month. It had real cool covers. There were always drawings of smiling white people on it standing next to cars with wings, or sitting in private submarines, or eating a whole meal in one little pill. The covers were real interesting, but the insides were real boring. Yep, good old Scientific Popular. They had an article about some frequencies and said that certain sounds cause certain effects in all living things, even weird Watsons. It said the sound of one of those vacuum cleaners can put a baby to sleep, and it works. Mama laughed a little. It was strange for all of us to see Dad talking so much. When we first hit Alabama and had a bunch of miles to go and you kids are popping up like prairie dogs and crying and saying, how much longer? And, Mommy, make them stop. And, is that Birmingham over there? All I did was to use a little vacuum trick. I started buzzing like a Hoover vacuum and you guys dropped off in reverse seniority. First Joey dropped, then Kenneth, then Daddy Cool, and then even you, Alona. Shoot, you guys were out cold from the state line on. I threw a blanket over you in the back seat, and even those whines and whimpers and moans you guys were making didn't bother me. And you, Walona, once I got buzzing, the only thing that was coming out of your mouth was drool. Is that what that sound was? Mama asked. I thought you were driving so long you lost your mind. I'm still not sure you haven't. Everybody woke up, but it was a fake wake up. We were all soon back asleep, even though it was morning. The next thing I remember, I was waking up back in the back seat, and Mama was saying real Southern, babies, we're home. Mama was honking the horn of the brown bomber like she was crazy. I raised my head out of the seat to look at what Mama was calling home and couldn't believe it. Birmingham looked a lot like Flint. They were real houses, not little log cabins all over the place, and great, big, beautiful trees. Most of all, though, there was the sun. Me, Joetta, and Byron unfolded ourselves into the Alabama heat, and it was like we all remembered at once that we were going to finally see what Grandma Sands really looked like. We all bunched up together by Mama's door, but she didn't get out. She was still honking the horn like a nut. We had to cover our ears. Dad said, "Nothing's changed." The door of a regular little old house opened. Me and Joey had never seen Grandma Sands in our lives. Byron said he could remember that she was the meanest, ugliest person in the world, but that was probably lying. He was only 4 the last time Mama and Dad were here. Byron said he'd had nightmares for a couple of weeks after they left Alabama 10 years ago. All of the weird Watsons had real good imaginations, but none of us was ready for what came out of the door of that house. I was expecting a troll. I thought Grandma Sands would be bigger than Dad. I thought she'd be foaming at the mouth like she had rabies. I remember a couple of years ago how Mama had cried and cried when someone called from Alabama and told us Grandma Sands had had a little stroke, so I knew that she walked with a cane now. I imagined the cane would be as big as a tree trunk with crows and owls and lizards living in it. What came out was a teeny-weeny old woman that looked just like Mama would if someone shrank her down about 5 sizes and sucked all the juices out of her. Grandma Sands waved a little skinny stick in the air and said, "What are y'all doing here today? You ain't supposed to be here till Monday." Man, if you think Mama can talk Southern style, you should hear Grandma Sands. Mama was blubbering and smiling and covering her mouth with both hands and ran right up on the porch and nearly broke that little old woman in half. "How you doing, Mama?" she cried on the woman's shoulders, then held Grandma Sands out to look at her. "You look so good." Boy, Mama can lie when she wants to. "Y'all come on over here and give your granny a hug," my Southern style mother said. Me and Joey and Byron shuffled over in a little crowd, and when we got through pushing each other forward, I was at the front and had to go on the porch to hug Grandma Sands first. I tried to be real careful with her. She was just a little taller than me and skinnier than anything I'd ever seen alive. I could see her brown scalp right through her curly silver hair. Grandma Sands squeezed me hard and cried all over me. She wiped a bunch of tears away with a twisted up hand and blinked a couple of times before she looked at me. She was so short, she didn't even have to look down. She tried to say something, but she couldn't talk. She just stuck her bottom lip out some and nodded her head up and down a couple of times, then pulled me back to her and squeezed me like crazy. Mama slapped the back of my head and said, "Kenneth Bernard Watson, you best quit acting so silly and give your grandmother a good hug." I squeezed her a little. A smell like baby powder came out of her when I did. I really think I could feel her lungs when I touched her back. I don't know what got Joey started, but she was off to the races with her tears. She was the only one who'd practiced what she'd say to Grandma Sands. She sniffed a couple times, then said, "Hi, Grandma Sands. It's a real pleasure to meet you." You could only half understand what she was saying. She was blubbering so much. Grandma Sands matched Joey tear for tear. They squeezed each other for a while. Then Grandma Sands got her little squeaky voice back and said to Mama, "Lord, Lona, this child ain't you. Look at this baby, just as pretty and sweet as you." Mama and Joey grinned like 2 nuts. Byron was next. This was what I dreamed about. These were the 2 meanest, most evil people I'd ever known, and I knew only one of them was going to come out of this alive. There was going to be a battle, something like if Godzilla met King Kong, or if Frankenstein met Dracula, or when champion wrestler Bobo Brazil meets the Sheik. I imagined that a week or 2 after we got back to Flint, we'd get a phone call from Alabama with the winner of the big battle on the other end. If it was Byron, he'd talk kind of cool and low out the corner of his mouth and say, "Shoo, man, you better come get this old chick. I ate her alive." If Grandma Sands won the battle, we'd have to hold the phone away from our ear while she shouted, "Lona, you call this a bad child? This little saint's ready to come back north and go to Sunday school and scrub all y'all's floors." But as soon as I saw Grandma Sands, I knew that Byron would destroy this poor old woman. I was even afraid Mama might decide not to leave him in Alabama. Byron walked up on the porch real cool and kind of bent over to give Grandma Sands a hug. Grandma Sands squeezed him hard. "Lona, won't you teach these babies up north? Don't they know how to give no one a proper hug?" She held Byron by the arms and looked at him from top to bottom. "You grew up to be a fine-looking boy. You was so puny when you was born, you nearly worried us crazy. Got strong, too." She slapped Byron's arm, and he kind of laughed. Grandma Sands reached up and ran her wrinkly old hand over Byron's head. "A little short on hair, but we gonna get on just fine. What you think, Byron?" "Yes, ma'am." Good, good. See, there's lots of things you can do down here. Mr. Robert ain't much help as he used to be, so all them things he used to do, you can do now." Mama said, "Who? Mr. Who?" Dad came up on the porch and got a ton of hugs and tears, too. Then Grandma Sands pulled everybody together. Her little arms could only get around one person at a time, but as the weird Watson stood there with some of us laughing, some of us crying, and some of us looking cool, it felt like we were all wrapped up in a big ball. Grandma Sands kept saying, "My family, my beautiful, beautiful family." Except with that Southern-style accent and all the weeping, it sounded like she was saying family. Finally, the crowd started breaking up, and Grandma Sands said, "Now what am I going to feed y'all? I wasn't expecting you till Monday. Me and Mr. Robert usually just have leftovers on Sunday, but I guess if I'll go down to Job's and pick up some things, we can have chicken tonight. You good at following directions, Byron?" "Huh?" By's face twisted up. "What?" Grandma Sands' voice popped like one of those big brown grocery bags being snapped open. By looked surprised and said, "I meant, huh? Ma'am?" "You good at following directions. Job's is a good little walk." I said, "He can follow directions real good, Grandma Sands. He's not as dumb as he looks." I shut up real quick and wished I hadn't said anything when Grandma Sands looked at me and said, "Lona, maybe there's two who should be spending the summer down here with their granny." Everyone started going inside the ugly little house. Mama sounded worried. "Mama, who is this Mr. Robert?" Grandma Sands laughed just like the Wicked Witch of the West and said, "Honey, we gotta talk. You just be patient, and soon as he gets up, I want all y'all to meet him." "Soon as he gets up? Aw, Mama." Mama sounded real upset and disappointed and Southern, but not as disappointed as me. The way Byron kept his head down and was smiling and saying, "Yes, ma'am," this, and "No, ma'am," that, looked like he had surrendered before the first punch was thrown. Instead of King Kong and Godzilla, it was like King Kong and Bambi. Instead of Bobo, Brazil, and the Sheik, it was like Bobo, Brazil, and Captain Kangaroo. Instead of Dracula and Frankenstein, it was like Dracula and a giraffe. And Byron was all neck. He knew exactly what I was thinking. After Grandma Sands gave us directions, Byron looked at me sideways and said, "What the hell you staring at?" I just shook my head. "What you expect?" By asked. "You seen her? That bird's as old as dirt. She's so old, I bet she used to step over dinosaur turds. I ain't gonna have her death on my hands." I knew that was a lie. It seemed like all of the fight was out of Byron, and we'd only been in Birmingham for a couple of minutes. Chapter 12. That dog won't hunt no more. Birmingham was like an oven. That first night, I couldn't sleep at all. Me and Bai had to share a bed, and we both were sweating like two pigs. It got so hot that Byron didn't even keep a sheet on himself to make sure I didn't accidentally touch him in the night. He finally slept on the floor because he said it was a little bit cooler. When I got up, Byron was gone. I looked out of the window into the backyard, and Bai and Dad and Mr. Robert were standing under a great big tree with a dog. I went to the bathroom real quick, did my morning scratches, then ran out to be with the guys. Morning, Kenny. Morning, Dad. Morning, Mr. Robert. Morning, Bai. Byron just grunted and said, Man, you gotta quit drinking so much water. You sweated up the whole bed last night. I ain't sharing the bed with your leaking little butt. He looked at Dad. With your leaky little self again. Mr. Robert said, You boys get used to the heat. Dad petted the dog and said, He's too old to hunt? Oh yeah, that dog won't hunt no more. He's just like me, lost the desire. Both of us got to the point where we just couldn't pull the trigger. Both of us got to be just like Joe Louis toward the end. Remember his last fights, Daniel? Remember how Joe would just walk around the ring, waving that left fist like a threat? He just couldn't throw it. He just couldn't pull the trigger no more. His mind told him to do it, but his body wouldn't cooperate. That's me and Toddy. There's times at night I hear him howl, and I know he's dreaming about being back in the woods, but both of us know that's gone. Mr. Robert bent down and rubbed the dog's head. Yeah, son, in his day, this is the best coon dog in all of Alabama. Used to get $100 just to stud him. Byron rubbed the old, gray, nasty-looking dog's head, too. $100? Man! Yeah, me and Toddy saved each other's lives. Hate seeing him get so old. Judging by the way Mr. Robert looked, I bet the dog was saying the same thing about him. How'd you save his life? You haven't been coon hunting? No, sir. Well, there ain't too many animals wilder or tougher than an old coon. Most people think you just chase him up a tree and pop him, but that ain't half the story. Toddy had trailed this coon all the way out to this lake, and the coon went in the water. Now, most of the time a dog will stop right at the water. They know better than to go in, but Toddy must have just dove right in after that coon. He must have been half a mile ahead of me when I heard him holler and then get real quiet. What happened? That coon got him in the water and held his head under till he drowned himself. I stopped believing this junk right there. A raccoon drowning a dog? I looked at Bai and Dad, but they both were believing what Mr. Robert was saying. Dad said, I've heard about raccoons doing that. Oh yeah, Toddy here's living proof. Byron said, If he drowned, how come he ain't dead? Well, when I finally got to that lake, I seen the coon going out one way and Toddy nowhere in sight. And I knew what happened. I dove right in that water and started looking for him. Took me only a minute, dragged him back to shore, turned him upside down, let the water run out of him, held his mouth shut and breathed right in his nose. He kicked a couple times, then came to. Byron said, Man, that's too much. That's cool. All I could think of was that Mr. Robert was probably the only human being who'd ever put his mouth on a dog's nose. That was pretty cool. I asked Dad, when do we eat? Kenny, you're the only one who hasn't eaten already. Your mother and grandmother are in the kitchen. Go on in. I went back inside. Even before I got in, I could hear Mama saying that Birmingham wasn't anything like she remembered. Her favorite sayings got to be, What's this? And how long's this been like that? And when did that happen? And why do you do this like that? And most of all, Mama. Grandma Sands thought Mama was hilarious and cracked up every time Mama got upset or worried about something that she didn't remember or didn't like. Grandma must have seen The Wizard of Oz 1,000,000 times because every time she laughed, it sounded just like that Wicked Witch of the West. At first, her laugh was so scary that whenever me and Joey heard it, we wanted to go get behind something or someone. But after a while, we got used to it. It took us even longer to get used to the southern style of talking. Man, Grandma Sands and Mama would get yakking to each other, and we could only understand half of the things that they said. The smell of bacon dragged me right into the kitchen. Mama, Joey, and Grandma Sands were sitting at a little skinny kitchen table yakking. Morning, Kenneth. Morning, Mama. Morning, Joey. Morning, Grandma Sands. You sleep okay? It was real hot. Joey was sitting in Mama's lap, looking all drowsy. She said, I know, I was sweating all night. The bacon was sitting on a plate of a piece of paper towel. Mama had another piece of paper towel in her hands because all the things that Grandma Sands was telling her were making her hands get all sweaty and disgusting. I got some cereal and bread and bacon and sat at the skinny table with them. I must have interrupted something real important because as soon as I sat down, Mama acted like I disappeared and started asking Grandma Sands more questions. Well, what about Callie Lincoln? I always wonder what she's doing. Lona, didn't I write to you about that? They kept on talking and kept on oohing and eyeing, and Grandma Sands kept on interrupting breakfast by scaring me and Joey with that laugh, and Mama kept on saying, "Aw, Mama." And she kept on having to get up and get more paper towel to wipe her hands, and most of all, she kept on talking more and more Southern style. They talked about how much trouble people were having with some white kids down here, who got married to who, how many kids this one had, how many times that one was in jail, a bunch of boring junk like that. It didn't get any interesting until I noticed that Mama got real nervous before she said, "And what about you, Mama? Mr. Roberts seemed like a nice man and all, but..." Grandma gave that laugh, and my spoon flew out of my hand and spilled cornflakes on the table. Mama acted like she didn't notice, but without even looking at me, she handed me one of those nasty, soaking wet pieces of paper towel and kept looking at Grandma Sands. I was wondering when we'd get to that, Grandma Sands smiled. We've been good friends since right after you all left for Flint. Mama was being kind of rude. She interrupted and said, "Aw, Mama, good friends? What does that even mean?" "Well, Lona Sands, what is it that is bothering you? Why don't you just say what's on your mind?" Mama started wringing the neck of another piece of paper towel. "I just don't understand what's going on here. How come I never knew him? Did Daddy know him?" Mama said that last part like she was dropping a bomb on Grandma Sands. Grandma Sands looked at her for a minute. "Lona, things are different from what they were when you left. Nearly everything's changed. Your daddy's been gone for almost 20 years. Grandma Sands had stopped smiling. "Now, Mr. Robert is my dearest friend." Well, I could see where Byron learned how to say a couple of words and have people think he'd said a whole bunch more. Grandma Sands didn't yell or scream or anything, but the way she said those couple things made everybody who heard it shut their mouths and listen real hard. Even though she only told Mama that Mr. Robert was her friend, it seemed like I heard her also give my mother a real good scolding. Mama pouted and kissed the top of Joey's head. I picked up my spoon and kept eating. This was great. I'd never seen Mama act like a little kid who just got yelled at, but there she was, picking out a piece of paper towel and looking kind of embarrassed. Dad and Byron came in with Mr. Robert. "Mr. Robert's going to walk us over to the lake, show us a big fishing spot for later. Joey, Kenny, you coming? Give those two some time alone to talk." Mama pushed Joey off her lap, and we followed the little parade outside. The heat made me and Joey feel like we couldn't wake up. I didn't want to do any walking, but the dirty dogs made me go anyway. The only kid that acted like he was having any fun was Byron. He walked the whole way with Mr. Robert and Dad and laughed and joked at them about every stupid story they told. When we finally got back, I went to sleep under a fan. They were going to force me to go fishing with Byron and Joey the next day, and I knew I needed a ton of rest. I started to think that making Byron spend all of his summer in this heat was more punishment than even a juvenile delinquent like him deserved. But he seemed like he was having a great time.